Good evening. If anyone's looking for seats, there's some seats down here, some seats over there. If you walk down toward the front, it'll be easy to see. Some on the aisle over here. So come on down. There's some seats left. I'm Mike Kensler. I'm the director of the Sustainability Office here at Auburn, and I can't tell you how happy I am to welcome you here tonight for at least two reasons. One, we've been excited about this for more than a year. And the second reason is the fact that you are all here after all this brutal weather today. I can't tell you how grateful we are that you all showed up. We started this Sustainability Speaker Series for the same reason that the Office of Inclusion and Diversity started their Critical Conversation Series, which is to bring thought leaders and experts to campus to help us think more deeply and act more boldly when it comes to solving our global grand challenges. Because the goal of all this effort is to create a world that, in the language of Oxford economist Kate Raworth, creates a safe and just place for all of humanity within the life-giving means of our planet. And that's really the whole point of the sustainability movement. It's based on our core values. And another quote from renewable energy expert Amory Lovins, who said, all these crises we face, we shouldn't see them as threats, but as chances to remake the future so that it serves all beings. I love that because that's a morally based, ethically based, aspirational statement. And this whole movement is based on our shared humanity and our shared common values. And speaking of sustainability, one of my frustrations is that the movement has not done a very good job creating a shared set of concepts about what it really is. They're all over the place, and I find people are often confused. So I want to take just a couple minutes, and at least for the context of tonight, create a shared understanding for this conversation about what I think is the grandest challenge of all, tackling climate change. Our definition is on this banner over here. Meeting human needs now and in the future. In other words, sustainability right off the bat is about people in a fair, just, and equitable way, meaning we cannot have the haves and have-nots. Everybody deserves their human rights met within the life-giving means of the planet, while remembering that we have to protect and preserve and nurture the biosphere if we expect to survive and thrive. As a framing tool, we use a sustainability compass, which is also over there on that banner. It was created by Alan Atkinson in the early 1990s, and we love that thing. It's on our water bottles. It's on the back of my business card. I have a hat. I'm even thinking about getting a tattoo. So, you know, we love this thing. But the compass does a really good job helping us remember that sustainability is about whole system thinking. So each of the four cardinal points of the compass represents a system condition for a sustainable world. To the north, N stands for nature. Humanity is just beginning to learn how to live in accord with the laws and limits of nature. It's a requirement for sustainable living. To the east is the economy. We need to create a 21st century economy that does, as Kate Raworth describes, create a safe and just place for all humanity within the life-giving means of our planet. This idea we use about perpetual growth as a model for economic well-being is frankly absurd. And the guy who invented it, Simon Kuznets, said that in the 1930s. He says it is not a good measure of societal well-being. So we already know the concepts. Can we summon the will to act on them? In terms of society, we need conditions from the neighborhood to our role as global citizens to create a world where we can all thrive. For communities like ours, that means a healthy business community, good schools, strong faith community, a sense of civic identity and individual empowerment, and yet in the context of what we aspire to be as a community, what we value, who we are, and we're going to work together to make sure that we're going to make Auburn and Opelika, this whole area, special for everybody in it. If nature is the ultimate means for creating human well-being to the west is the ultimate ends of the sustainability movement, where all of us have our human rights protected, I'll say it again, within the life-giving means of the planet. And when it comes to solving climate change, it has been argued, and I agree with this, if we can actually solve that problem, stop putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and draw down what's there, to do that requires tackling social issues, technological issues, and environmental issues. And doing that will do much more than solve problems. We will create a transformed world. So that's what this is all about. Before I invite my colleague up here to introduce our speaker, I've been asked to remind you that if you are not registered to vote, or if you need to change your registration, please stop and do that out here. You know, we're coming on the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. At the time of that first Earth Day, 20 million people were in the streets. It was the largest demonstration in American history. And what made it so powerful, it was citizen action that drove the creation of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act. All that legislation came from citizen action, citizens demanding action. So please register and vote. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Martine Medina, who's an associate professor in geosciences in the College of Science and Mathematics. Martine is a highly respected climate scientist in his own right, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Martine?
Thank you, Mike. Welcome. I want to welcome you all. This is a very, very special night, and I'm so glad to see so many of you, even with these glasses. So my name is Martine Medina, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geosciences here at Auburn University. And I study climate evolution, and I teach a course with my colleague Karen McNeil, what is called Climate Change and Society here in Auburn for undergraduates and graduate students. Some of my students are here right now. Thank you for being here. So about a year and a half ago, I was sitting in my house watching a National Geographic documentary series on climate change. And every episode featured celebrities and notorious scientists who were actively helping in many different ways solve the serious problems associated with our changing climate. The documentary was called Years of Living Dangerously, which I highly recommend it to you. And so I was watching, I started from episode 1, and this episode featured a female climate scientist who also happened to be an evangelical Christian. And I thought, wait a second. So how could a scientist and also reconcile, and also an evangelical Christian, reconcile these seemingly opposing views of our existence and existence of this universe, something that philosophers have been trying to do for ages. And so as I was watching the documentary, I decided to look her up. And so this woman was Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. And I found out that she was actually, she was one of the lead authors of the US National Climate Assessment, which is the most rigorous and detailed scientific document on the impacts of climate change on US territory. If you want to know something about what's going to happen or what is happening here in the US, you look at that document. And I also found out that Dr. Hayhoe was one of Christianity Today's Women to Watch, one of Time's most influential people, one of foreign policy's leading global thinkers, and one of Fortune's world's greatest leaders, and also, importantly, one of working mothers' most influential moms. And I have my wife to attest to that. This is just a short list. And after I learned about Katharine, Jill, my wife, happened to come, and I said, Jill, I just found this woman. I want to, it's a climate scientist. She's an evangelical Christian. I want to invite her to come to Auburn. And she said, okay, let me put the groceries away. And so she looked her up, and she was, in the moment, she fell in love with Katharine. So, she recommended me to talk to Mike Kensler from the Office of Sustainability, because he would be very interested in Katharine. So I went to his office, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be prepared to tell Mike who this person is. And I started, well, Mike, I've invited this climate scientist who happens to be an evangelical Christian. And at that moment, Mike jumped out of his, Katharine Hayhoe? Are you invited? Katharine Hayhoe is coming to Auburn? And I was like, wow, I've never seen him that excited. So ever since then, Mike and his office have been working tirelessly, incessantly, to make this event happen. I want to thank him and his office. I want to thank also Jen, who's also the communications and outreach manager in the office. She's coordinating this event right now. And well, now on behalf of Auburn University, the Department of Geosciences, the Office of Sustainability, and everybody here, I want to welcome you and thank you for the honor of being here and visiting us. Thank you, Katharine.
What Martine did not mention was he was actually a bit sneaky about the invitation. He asked me to present in the scientific session at the conference that we were both attending first. And then once I was there, he's like, have you ever been to Auburn? I said, no, but I'd love to come. So we're going to have a conversation tonight, and I'm just delighted to see how many people have showed up. So I woke up this morning in Charlotte because I only travel in person when I have a lot of things to do in one place. I don't just go for one event. So I woke up in Charlotte this morning, and I got a text from Mike saying, I don't know about today. Classes are canceled. There's a tornado watch. I don't know if you can get here. So I went ahead to the airport in Charlotte, and as soon as I got there, they closed the airport down because there was a tornado going through the north part of Charlotte. So for a long time, I wasn't sure that I could get here, but we managed to get here, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'm glad that you all are too. We're going to be talking about climate change, and you're going to be talking a little bit with me too. As you came in, they probably asked you if you had a smartphone, and the reason for that is I like to ask you questions as well as you asking me questions. So if you have a smartphone, please go ahead and take it out. If you have not turned off the ringer, please go ahead and do that too. If you have a computer with you, you can use the computer instead if you prefer. And what you want to do is you want to go to pollev.com. That is pollev.com. It'll ask you to enter something. You need to enter Texas Tech, all one word. I hear we do have a few Texas Tech basketball fans here. Sorry. Just kidding. There is no allegiance whatsoever. That's just the word I have to use because it is my university. Enter Texas Tech, all one word, no capitals. And then, if it asks you for your name, don't worry about that. Anonymous is fine. And then the first question that you're going to be asked is this. And I can see already that the undergraduate students already got to this. So, are you A, undergraduate student, B, a graduate student, C, faculty and staff, or D, community member? Now, we'll give it a little bit of time because from personal experience, I know that A tends to jump immediately into the lead because you're so fast. But you need to give people time to catch up, as we learned in the Iowa caucuses. So we'll give a bit of time. See, look, community members are starting to, they're not going to take over, but they're starting to come out. Okay, 10, yep. Oh, 11, okay, oh, 12, see, takes a little while. So it looks like we're starting to stabilize around half undergraduates, and then 20% faculty or staff, graduate students, and community members. That's a good mix. All right. Now, we're talking about climate change tonight. So my next question relates to climate change, and it's pretty simple too. Ready? Do you believe in climate change? Yes, no, or it's none of anybody's business. And I will just remind you, this is 100% anonymous. It really, truly is. So you can answer whatever you want. Oh, the C's have shrunk. The C's were kind of quick to hit C off the bat. And it looks like the number isn't there, but I'm going to guess 1% and 1%. So 98%, 1 and 1. All right. Well, I have to admit that was a little bit of a trick question because if you asked me my answer to it, my answer would actually be no. And you might say, hang on a second here. I thought you were a climate scientist. I am. I thought we were going to talk about climate change. We are. So why would I say that I don't believe in it? Well, this relates directly to the title of the talk. If you go to Google, which is where we store our brains these days, I don't know if you've heard that, right? But we remember less now that we know that we can just Google it. If you go to Google, the definition of science that it gives us is the systematic study of the physical and natural world through observing and experimenting. And the definition it gives us for faith is a strong belief that is based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. Now, if you flip this and you actually go to the Bible, you have definitions there too. There's a verse in the book of Hebrews, which is a chapter that's about faith, that says, faith is what? It's the substance of things that we hope for and the evidence of what we don't see. It's almost the same. But if I had been there 2,000 years ago, I would have been like, you forgot the other half of the verse. Clearly, the other half of the verse is this. Now, science is the substance of things that are here and now, the evidence of things that we can observe, right? So I don't believe in climate change because it is not a matter of faith. With science, as Google tells us, with science, we study the physical and natural world. We observe it and we experiment on it, and we make up our minds based on the facts and information that we see in the here and now, not through spiritual apprehension. That's an important distinction, because a lot of the framing that goes on, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, a lot of the framing that goes on is framing climate change as a religion. Have you ever heard it framed as a religion? It's an earth-worshipping religion, it's a pagan religion, it's a religion that you believe in instead of God. So framing it as a religion, when most of us have a belief that we're okay with, the vast majority of us, over 70% in the US, over 80% worldwide, belong to some faith tradition, we're not looking for a new one. So framing climate change as a religion is a way to actually get a lot of people to reject it. We need the science, though, and we need the science for 4 things. What do we need the science for that our faith won't give us? The first thing is to tell us that, yes, climate really is changing. Now, you might say, hang on, we know that we've always had extreme weather, and we have. We've always had floods, although this is actually from today. You can check the date. It literally is today. We have always had droughts, right? Also this past year. We have always had hurricanes. That's just part of life on the Gulf Coast. We have always had heat waves. And weather is like a single tree. It's what happens in a certain place at a certain time. And here's the interesting thing. Weather is what our brains are built to remember. Our brains all remember weather. I'm going to prove that using your help. I want you to think of the most memorable weather event that you've ever lived through. And I want you to tell me what that is using either one word, or if you have to use more than one word, join the words with a dot or a dash. So if you're going to say, for example, dust storm, either say dust storm, all one word, or say dust dot storm, okay? We all have a weather story, and yes, exactly. If you don't have a weather story, where were you today? That's your weather story. Your mom is your weather story. Yes. So we've got tornadoes, we've got hurricanes, we've got snow. We've got Andrew, assuming that's the hurricane. Yep, snowpocalypse, yep, rainstorm, thunderstorms. We all have a weather story because that's what our brain remembers. But climate is like the forest. Climate is the long-term average of weather of at least 20 to 30 years. So for your brain to be able to remember climate, you would have to remember the temperature on every day of the year for at least 20 years in a row. And you'd have to be able to add that all up in your head and calculate the average and the trend. Now, I didn't bother to put up a question. I'm just going to ask you, is there anybody who can do that in their brain without using a pen, pencil, or computer? Okay, good. You're honest. We aren't built to remember climate. Climate is a profoundly non-intuitive concept for us. And so that's why between the months of November and April, the number one thing I hear is, it's freezing outside, where's global warming now? But using one day during the winter when it is occasionally cold, using one day as proof that the entire planet is not warming over climate timescales is like being on the Titanic. You remember the Titanic? If you don't know what that was, you'll have to watch the Titanic. It's like being on the Titanic and saying the Titanic can't be sinking because my end just went 200 feet up in the air. You have to look at the whole picture. Well, then people say, okay, sure, I'm looking at the whole picture. I'm looking at global average temperature measured by thousands of thermometers around the whole world. And when I look at global average temperature, it looks like this, Katharine. So how can you say it's warming? Well, I would say, So that goes from about 2000 to about 2010, and we said climate was the long-term average of weather over how many years? At least 20 to 30. So how about we just fill in the rest of the data here? You can see that from year to year, our global temperature goes up and down, but decade by decade by decade, it ticks steadily upwards. So then people say, oh, I know what's happening. You scientists are just faking the data because it is, notice the words here, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration seems to be a captive of what? The global warming religion. See? Its data are fraudulent. So what I say, that's one of my favorite objections, is I say, fine, throw out every thermometer reading on the planet. Throw out all of our satellite data. Throw out ocean buoys. Throw out every piece of scientific observation on the planet, because to tell that the planet is warming, all we need is our eyes. Our eyes tell us that glaciers are disappearing, that permafrost is thawing, that trees are blooming earlier and earlier in the year, that animals and insects and birds are moving further north. Where I live in West Texas, my colleague had a peach tree in the backyard. And because he was an ecologist, yes, the stereotypes are true. Because he was an ecologist, he wrote down the day the peach tree flowered every year. When he had to cut down that tree 2 years ago, it was flowering on average 2 to 3 weeks earlier in the year than when he planted it 30 years ago. If we look around the entire world and we add up all the independent lines of evidence telling us that the planet is warming that we can see with our eyes, you know how many independent lines of evidence there are? 26,500. So if it really is a conspiracy, somehow that conspiracy is not only faking temperature data going back to the 1600s, it is also somehow forcing every tree to bloom earlier. It's forcing glaciers to somehow melt. It's forcing animals to somehow move. I mean, the scale of the conspiracy to do that is beyond anything. A lot of people don't put those pieces together. So science tells us that it really is warming, and science also tells us why it's warming. Now, this is where a lot of our objections come in. So get out your phones again. I want you to tell me, okay? What is the most common sciencey sounding objection that you have heard when it comes to climate change? A, we haven't studied this long enough. B, it's cold outside. C, it's been warmer before. D, it's just the sun or a natural cycle or volcanoes. And E, scientists are making it up to line their pockets. I would just like to confirm that my pockets are empty. Okay. I'm glad to see it's D because we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that one. We are not making it up to line our pockets, and we already covered it's cold outside. But let's talk about the other reasons why climate has changed in the past. Because imagine if you were running a fever, and it was a low-grade fever, and it would go up and down from day to day, but week by week it started to go higher and higher. Imagine you go into the doctor's office, and without running any tests, the doctor takes one look at you, screams coronavirus, runs out of the room, returns in a full hazmat suit, and straps you to a gurney and puts you in quarantine. You'd be like, you're an idiot. I probably just have food poisoning, or maybe I have the regular flu, which incidentally is much more dangerous than coronavirus, as we were just talking about. In the same way as scientists, we don't automatically assume it's humans. You got to look at everything else first before you assume that. So let's start with natural cycles. We know that it's been warmer before in the past as a result of natural cycles. Natural cycles work like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. What they do is they take the heat that's inside the climate system and they move it around. They move it from east to west, north to south, and from the ocean to the atmosphere and back again. That's what a natural cycle does. So if a natural cycle makes one part of the world warmer, that heat has to come from somewhere else in the climate system. Let me give you an example of a classic natural cycle. A classic natural cycle is the medieval warm period. Through putting together natural thermometers from trees and ice cores and pollen records, we can actually see what temperature was like during the medieval warm period. You can see that it was warmer. Let me zoom in there a little bit. It was about 0.5 degree to 1 degree warmer than average over the North Atlantic. And this was when the Vikings came all the way across to Canada, when they colonized Greenland. Does that mean Greenland was green? It wasn't green. But by the time you got there, it was too late. So it was one of the most successful PR marketing strategies of the Middle Ages. So during the medieval warm period, it was unusually warm by about 0.5 degree to 1 degree over the North Atlantic. But if you lived in Siberia at the exact same time, it was the medieval cold period. So why do we hear about this? It's because our civilization is predominantly based on Western European history. Isn't that interesting? So this is a classic natural cycle. Now, if the entire atmosphere is warming, and as we just saw here, it is, if the entire atmosphere is warming, that heat has to be coming from somewhere. So what we can do is we can say, all right, if the heat content of the atmosphere is going down, if it's a natural cycle, it would have to be coming from somewhere else. The only place it could be coming from is the ocean. So if the heat content of the atmosphere is going up and the heat content of the ocean is going down, we know it's a natural cycle. So let's look at the data. Ready? This is the data. Now you might say, what am I looking at here? The green is the increase in the heat content of the atmosphere and land and ice too, all put together since the 1960s. And the blue is the increase in the heat content of the ocean. It's not the same amount the opposite direction, it's 20 times more. In fact, if we're using air temperature as a measure of global warming, it's like using the tip of the iceberg when 90% of it is underwater. So you might say, why are we not talking about this? And the only answer I have for you is we're not dolphins. I'm actually serious about that. Because otherwise we'd be talking about this a lot, because this is a huge amount of warming. And when we look at what it was like during the medieval warm period, we can compare it to what it looks like today on the exact same scale. This is what it looks like today on the exact same scale. So no, it is not natural cycles. Then people might say, okay, well, what about the sun? Could it be the sun? We know that the Earth's temperature has been going up, and if we were getting warmer because of the sun, what would be happening to the sun's energy? Would it be going up, or would it be going down? Not a trick question, up. I'm sure some of you are like, oh, I bet it's a trick question. No. Think about a lamp. When you turn the dimmer switch up on a lamp, you turn it up, it gets brighter, more heat, right? So let's look at the sun's energy. The sun's energy has an 11-year sunspot cycle that goes up and down every 11 years. It was actually discovered by Galileo. But since the 1970s, the sun's energy has been doing what? Going down. So it can't be the sun causing us to warm. That makes no sense. So then people might say, oh, but aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? We know that there was an ice age because we've all watched the movie. And we know why the ice age ended. And this picture shows us why, right? There was a rodent looking for somewhere to bury an acorn. Where did he find an acorn on the ice sheet, first of all? And he buried it in the wrong place, and it started to crack, and the whole ice sheet fell apart. Just kidding. We know that actually the ice ages are caused by orbital cycles. The Earth's orbit around the sun becomes more circular over time and then more elliptical. And then also, you know when you spin a wooden top, have you ever spun like a children's top, like a toy? You spin it and it goes around really fast. That's what the Earth does every day. But then it also goes like this more slowly. And that's what the Earth does too over 40,000 years. So that affects how sunlight falls on the Earth. So where are we in the orbital cycles? Well, it turns out that warming after the last ice age peaked about 6,000 years ago. And we were heading into the next ice age until something happened. So we aren't still getting warmer after the last ice age. We were getting cooler again until the last 100 years. So if it isn't natural cycles, the sun, or orbital cycles, could it be the last one, volcanoes? Because everybody knows that one volcanic eruption produces more heat-trapping gases than all the humans on the planet, right? Said the man on my Facebook page today. I'm serious. No, unfortunately, that is wrong. Volcanic eruptions produce particles that actually cool the Earth off. We are cooler for anywhere from a few weeks to even 2 or 3 years after a big volcanic eruption. And all geologic activity, not really volcanoes, but you know, if you've been to Yellowstone National Park, all those kind of funny smelling gases coming out of the Earth, those are heat-trapping gases, but if you put it all together over the whole world, it's about as much as 3 medium-sized US states. So it isn't any of these that are causing the warming. And that's when we can say, could it be something else? Could it be the fact that the Industrial Revolution was powered by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil? We know that our planet has a natural blanket. Is this playing? Yes. We already know that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps us 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. That's our happy planet. The sun's energy shines down and goes through that blanket like a window. The Earth heats up and gives off heat energy, and that blanket traps the heat like a blanket traps your body heat on a cold night. That blanket is what is responsible for life on Earth. We would be a frozen ball of ice without that blanket. So if it's entirely natural, which it is, and entirely good, which it is, what's the problem? The problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. And just like when I used to go stay at my grandma's house, and she would sneak in every night, and put a blanket on me, and I'd wake up sweating, saying, "Grandma, I didn't need that extra blanket." In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need. How long have we known about our blanket? Since the work of this man in the 1820s. How long have we known that digging up and burning coal at that time, later oil and gas, how long have we known that digging up coal produces more heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet? Since the 1850s. These are the real pictures. These are not like the old-timey things where your family dresses up, you know, like the Wild Western. No. 1850s is how long we've known. We've known that the planet would warm since the calculations of this man, who is actually an ancestor of Greta Thunberg. Yes. And we've actually measured the warming of the planet in weather stations from the work of Guy Callendar in the 1930s. So the science tells us it's real. The science tells us we do know that it is humans for the first time. And what else does the science tell us? It tells us that the impacts are serious. I am a lead author on the National Climate Assessment. It is more than 2,000 pages long, single-spaced. I am now going to summarize what it has to say about Alabama in 5 minutes. You're welcome. I'll be taking subscriptions to my Reader's Digest condensed books afterwards. What's happening in Alabama? Why does it matter to us here? First of all, the warmer the atmosphere gets, the more water vapor there is in it. So when a storm comes along today, there's a lot more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And we are already seeing the changes happen. Since the 1950s until now, we have seen a 58% increase in heavy rainfall across this region. And if you look at it by individual weather station, this is looking at it by weather station. Each of those dots is a different weather station, so you can kind of see where Auburn would be on that map. You see that some of them are going down and some of them are going up, but most of the dots are red, and the darker red it is, the bigger the increase that we're seeing. We also know that heat waves are getting more common and cold waves are getting less frequent, although we still have cold temperatures. It's called winter. Maybe not in Auburn. And what we've especially noticed is that warm nights are getting more frequent. So the human body can stand some pretty hot days as long as we can cool off at night. But if we can't cool off at night, that's when it really starts to affect our health. What else do we see? Well, sea level rise is not only happening, it is getting faster. In fact, the headline from just 2 days ago was another new study saying that sea level rise is accelerating along US coastlines. And we also see that hurricanes are becoming more dangerous. Now, hurricanes aren't getting more frequent. Sometimes we have bad years, sometimes we have good years. Which is which depends on your perspective. There are some hurricane meteorologists who enjoy seeing them and flying into them. I actually talked to somebody who flies into hurricanes once. Oh, I would never do that. If anybody says, hey, would you like to fly into a hurricane, just tell them no. You do not ever want that experience. But for most of us, we view hurricanes as a negative, dangerous thing, as we should. And they're not getting more frequent, but they are getting more dangerous because hurricanes are a unique type of storm that get their energy from one place, the ocean. And remember that figure that we looked at with that big blue area? That's the heat content going into the ocean. So have you ever taken a hairdryer to Europe and plugged it in? That's another thing I wouldn't recommend doing. Because our hairdryers are for our electricity here, and when you go over to Europe, they've got twice the power. You plug it in and you fry it. Why? Because it's not built to hold that much power. Well, unfortunately, hurricanes can hold more power. And so as they go over warm ocean water, what you're looking at here is you're looking at the track of Hurricane Irma. That's the track. You can see it's about to head over some really warm ocean water. And you know what happens when it does that? It ramps up from a category 1 or 2 to 3, 4, or 5. So they're getting more intense. They have a lot more rainfall associated with them. They're intensifying faster. More of them are stronger, the same number, but more of them are the stronger ones. They're also moving more slowly and getting bigger, and of course sea level is rising too, so their storm surge is worse. It's estimated that almost 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston would not have fallen if the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago, which it easily could have. There was a great article just this past summer, this is August, in the Montgomery Advisor on climate and change, rising temperatures, and how they're transforming Alabama. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to, if you have your phone out, you can go ahead and take a picture if you want to. It's a good way to remember things. Check this out because it goes into much more detail and tells a lot more stories, and they've got videos from local scientists talking specifically about what is happening in Alabama. But the bottom line is this. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us. We always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. What's that? A hurricane, a flood, a heat wave, a storm. But as the planet warms, decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and taking that 3 and replacing it with another 6. So all of a sudden, you're rolling too many double sixes, and you're thinking, what is happening? The dice are getting loaded against us. And we see this everywhere. I don't know if you remember, but back in December 2017, so 2 years ago, the Thomas Fire became the largest wildfire on record in California. That record was broken in August by the Ranch Fire. It was smashed by the Camp Fire in November. And what were the headlines this past November? California wildfires. Is wildfire normal in California? Yes. Are we seeing more frequent wildfires? No. We're actually not, because almost all of the wildfires in the lower 48 are human ignition. people plugging something in their shed that they shouldn't have, power lines that spark, somebody tossing a cigarette out the window. One of the wildfires in California this past November was started by an idiot who dumped a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Who does that? So the numbers, unfortunately, aren't changing. They should be going down. Remember Smokey the Bear? But what is changing is the area burned. Because when the fire starts, there's a lot drier conditions, so it will burn more area. Without a changing climate, we would have seen about 11 million acres burned since 1980. With the changing climate, we've seen more than twice that. So climate change is loading the dice against us. Of course, it's not just in California. Where's this? Australia. Up in Alaska, they had their warmest summer on record this year. The sea ice around Alaska completely melted for the first time in recorded history. Permafrost is thawing. Wildfires were devastating the state. In last spring, it's hard to remember, we've had so many disasters, but last spring the Midwest was covered in floodwater. Floods are normal, but that much? In Miami, this is actually a picture from a real estate blog. Isn't that interesting? From Miami, they're raising the level of the streets in South Miami by 2 feet because they are going to be impacted much more by storm surges as sea level rises. In Hawaii, they've got marine heat waves that are bleaching their corals. In Europe, they had 500-year summers in 15 years. Now, you're probably promised there'd be no math. But if you have 5 of them in 15 years, is that a 500-year event? No, it's a 3-year event. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, which was one of the islands that was devastated in the hurricane season in 2017, he said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived." And this past year, the Yale climate opinion researchers saw the biggest jump in the levels of people who are concerned about climate change that they'd ever measured in 10 years. And when they asked me, I said, well, there's multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is we can now see the stuff happening. You don't have to go up to Alaska anymore. We are seeing the impacts everywhere. So it's time for you to tell me again, get out your phones. What have you seen about climate change in the news? Remember, if you're going to use more than one word, use a dot or a dash to connect them. What have you seen about climate change in the news? Yep, I have seen all of those things, yes. So Australian fires, fake news, I see a lot of that. I showed you some of it already today. The Arctic melting, coral bleaching, getting worse. Youth action, I like that. Heat waves, insect apocalypse. Yeah. People. Oh, I like some of these answers. Running out of time. I tune out. I definitely sympathize with that one. Whoever said nothing, just read the news anytime. It's in there about every week. So, what is the last thing that science tells us? Science tells us it's real, it's us, it's serious, and the last thing that science tells us is this: it's time to act. Greta Thunberg's ancestor, Arrhenius, was the first person to show us what the difference would make if we kept on using fossil fuels versus if we didn't. The numbers he calculated in 1890 were remarkably similar to the numbers we get from our most powerful supercomputers today, showing that there's a huge difference in the world that depends on one thing: our choices. Our choices are the biggest uncertainty in what our future holds. What carbon budget will keep our emissions low enough to avoid dangerous impacts? Because the bottom line is that we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only planet that we have. That is what the science tells us. It's real, it's serious, and the window of time to prevent widespread dangerous impacts is closing fast. Okay, so that's the science. So in 1992, Every country in the world got together in Rio, Brazil, and they signed this in 1992. They agreed to stabilize greenhouse gas levels, so carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, stabilize levels in the atmosphere to prevent what? Dangerous human interference with the climate system. And then we spent 25 years arguing over what dangerous is. Why did we spend 25 years arguing over it? Because dangerous is not a scientific term. What one person views as dangerous is not what another person views as dangerous. If you ask many people today, what's the most dangerous illness in America right now, or what are you most scared of? Many people would say what? Coronavirus, right? Yet do you know that 10,000 people have already died of the ordinary flu this year? That's a little more dangerous. So our sense of what is dangerous completely depends on our perspective. You're in more danger of dying in your car within a mile of your home than you are in airplanes, yet people have panic attacks in airplanes all the time, and they rarely have one in the car. People are worried about getting bit by a shark when they go swimming in the ocean, but cows kill many more times people than sharks. Few people have panic attacks around cows. Now you will, after you heard that. So dangerous is not a science issue. Dangerous has emotions attached to it. It has values attached to it. And here's where we start to connect. Because where do our values come from? For many of us, if we belong to a specific religious tradition or specific faith, our values come from our faith. And religious leaders are speaking out on this. There's a man called the Pope, who you might have heard of, who wrote an entire book about climate change 5 years ago. It was called an encyclical. And this whole book lays out in very clear terms what the science says, and it also says why it matters. Because, and again, this is where the values come in, it matters because it affects the poorest people on the planet. The Pope is not alone. Evangelicals have spoken out on this issue. The negative consequences and the burdens of a changing climate fall on those who Jesus called the least of these, the poor, the vulnerable, and the oppressed. There is a Hindu declaration on climate change. We must consider the effect of our action, not just on ourselves and on the humans around us, but on all beings to ensure a functioning, abundant, and bountiful planet. There's an Islamic declaration on climate change. Our species has been the cause of corruption and devastation. We may lose our fine equilibrium if we do not act. You get the picture. I can keep on going here. There's not a single major tradition in the world that doesn't have a statement that hasn't been made. Yet when we hear people talk about climate change, we hear them invoke religiously sounding objections. Like what? Climate change and weather changes and atmospheric changes have been happening since the Lord created the world. Don't worry, we have Texas too. Climate change, I'm an equal opportunity discriminator. Climate change is not science, it's religion. Al Gore was the one who did it. The proof is on the internet. You just Google it and here we go. And if you've got good eyes, you'll notice that somebody photoshopped my head onto the choir. When we look at the data, and we ask, how concerned are you about climate change? We can see that the most concerned people group in the entire United States are Hispanic Catholics. And you might say, well, of course, because the Pope, right? Yes, but who is the least concerned group? For those of you who can't see the tiny writing, I will read it to you. It says white Catholics. And you might say, hang on, do they not have the same Pope? Yes, they do. So a couple of years ago, the Pope came to visit, and I was talking to a congressman who was Catholic who was really excited about meeting the Pope. He was telling me all about the dinners he would go to, the chances he would have to meet the Pope and talk to him, whether he'd be able to have a photo with the Pope, whether his family could meet the Pope, whether the Pope was doing a special mass that he could go to. And so I said, well, so what do you think of the encyclical? Oh, the Pope's way off base there. But did I tell you about this dinner? So what do we do? Is it our religious values that are informing our opinion on climate change? Well, there's a senator from Oklahoma who wrote an entire book about how climate change is a hoax because man would be arrogant to think that we could change something that God created. He said, though, the same year, he said, do you realize I was on your side of this issue when I first heard about it? Till when? Till I opened the Bible? No. I thought it must be true till I found out how much it would cost to fix it. When we look at our opinions on climate change, they have nothing to do with how educated we are. They have nothing to do with how well we understand science. They have nothing to do with how smart we are. They have nothing to do with where we do or don't go to church. That is not the predictor of our opinion. Our opinions are based on one thing. It is where we fall on the political spectrum. And in the words of Galen Carey from the National Association of Evangelicals, he said, many evangelicals, and I would just say conservative Christians there because you can put in Catholics too, many evangelicals oppose climate action not on a religious basis but politically because why? Solution aversion. They believe the government wants to take away their freedom. So rather than being a barrier, our faith actually explains why we care. In Genesis 1, the first book of the Bible, first chapter of the Bible, it says that God made human beings in his image for a reason, and the reason is no mystery, to be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. This is where the concept comes from of stewardship or creation care, the idea that you've been given a piece of property, and if you extract every penny of value from it and you leave it a crumbling ruin, what does that say about how you feel about the person who gave it to you? Whereas if you invest in it, and it thrives, and it grows, and it supports people, it has healthy soil, you can grow food, it even has ecosystems, what does that say about the person who gave it to you? So this is where the whole idea of being stewards or gardeners or caretakers comes from. But this isn't even complete because often this fosters a false sense of us taking care of that. But just stop for a second and think about it. Are we designed to float around in outer space? No. We are humans who live on this planet, and this planet supplies the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. Every single piece of material that you use in every part of your life comes from this planet. We are living things too. So it isn't only about caring for it's about caring for us and for each other also. And this is part of our core values, not only as Christians, but every major world religion has this value in it, as bad as we are at actually expressing it. Today we have almost 8 billion people in the world. And the reason why our life expectancy in the West, primarily, has jumped from 40 years to 80 years in just 200 years, the number one reason is the Industrial Revolution. Just think about this. Imagine what your life was like before refrigerators, before electricity, before cars, before the medical advances. I know that I would have been dead long time ago. Imagine what life was like when the only labor was supplied by animals or by yourself, when doing the laundry took a full day, and that was when people only owned 2 outfits. But, yes, I'm very grateful for washing machines. But even more seriously, back then, with human labor as the primary source of economic growth, that labor was exploited in horrendous ways through child labor and through slave labor. Fossil fuels helped the North win the Civil War. So I'm actually grateful for what fossil fuels have brought us. And when people say, okay, well, so if fossil fuels brought us all these benefits, then if you look at where people live in poverty today, don't those people need the same fossil fuels we do? In fact, isn't it the moral thing, if we truly care about people, to give people the same sources of energy that we use to get where we are here today? Have you heard that argument before? I hear it quite a bit, especially in Christian circles. People say, how can we prevent more suffering? The answer is the same thing that we did, fossil fuels. Now, if we pulled the plug on all fossil fuels today all around the world, there would be suffering, massive suffering. And I'm not talking about that. But what's really interesting is the fact that the reason why we live in a rich country is because we had fossil fuels to begin with. If you look at where fossil fuels are and aren't in the world, and you look at where people live in poverty today, there's a big overlap. Of all the fossil fuel reserves left in the world, North America has 37%, Europe has 20%, the Middle East has 20%, all of Africa has 6%. So it isn't saying let each country exploit their own fossil fuels to power their own economic development, which is what we did. It's saying, why don't we sell them our fossil fuels and put them further in debt to us so that they can use our resources to develop the same way we did? All of a sudden, that sounds a little bit different, doesn't it? Then there's the cost associated with extracting the fossil fuels. The cheapest way to get at a lot of coal is simply cutting the top off the mountain. But when you do that, as my friend Marianne Hitt writes here, when you do that, it allows toxins to leak into the river. And so the very communities that depend on coal mining for their salaries, for their entire regional economy, those very communities are being poisoned by the industry that pays their salary. In the Niger Delta, where human rights violations are common, the health impacts of oil and gas extraction with none of the environmental regulations we have here at all are so incredibly huge that it has its own Wikipedia entry. And then when you start to burn these things, a study a few years ago said air pollution kills more than 5 million people, but then just last year they found no, it's actually double that. Air pollution is killing almost 9 million people around the world, including 200,000 in the United States today. And the people that it kills are the people who cannot afford to live somewhere with cleaner air, or to have health care, or to have a car to drive around instead of standing outside breathing the fumes. Climate change is a profoundly unjust issue, but the extraction and the combustion of fossil fuels is too. And then when we look at where people live in poverty, look at where they live, and then look at this map. This is who's most vulnerable to climate change. What do you see? It's pretty much the same, because climate change is, as the military calls it, a threat multiplier. It takes hunger and lack of access to clean water and diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2019, and it exacerbates them or makes them worse. So science tells us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and we must act. But it's our faith that tells us, it's our values that tell us why we care about it. Because it affects real people today, especially the poorest and most vulnerable among us. I'm a Christian, and I care about it because I believe that God actually gave us responsibility to care for the welfare of every living thing. As they say in the Texas version of the Bible, which they print on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, sign God. The Texas version is slightly more threatening than the real thing. But my faith comes in one last place, and it comes in here. How are we to respond? Because when we think about climate change, our response is often fear. On the one hand, there's fear of the devastating repercussions of climate change if we don't fix it. One of my colleagues told me that she has to be really careful even saying the words climate change in class because some of her students will have panic attacks. But at the other end of the spectrum, the opposition that we see to climate action is also fear-based. It's fear of what? It's fear of solutions that would destroy the economy, that would impose a totalitarian government, that would take away my freedoms, that would be in opposition to what I believe. And as Christians, we are actually told in the book of Timothy that if we're reacting out of fear, that is not who we are. What have we been given? We've been given three things. The ability to act. We are empowered to act. We aren't paralyzed or frozen like fear freezes you. We can act. We have the ability to have compassion on other people, thinking of other people, not just ourselves. And the last thing is my favorite. We have a sound mind to make good decisions based on the facts and information that we get from science. So what do these responses look like? I want to just seed you with a couple of ideas to end with, because this is where the good news is. It looks like what our communities are doing. Whether it's putting solar panels on a 1,000-year-old church in England, whether it's a church group right here in Alabama that wants to end the solar tax, whether it's looking at how you can plant pollinator-friendly plants in solar fields to maintain bee and insect populations, whether it's what companies are doing, powering themselves with clean energy, whether it's Walmart or Apple. What's happening in poor countries where 70% of the new energy being installed around the world today, 70% of the new electricity is clean energy because it's cheaper and it works for where they live. There's an awesome website. If you want to take a picture of this, I recommend it. It's called Project Drawdown, and it lists 100 solutions to climate change. Some of them you have heard of, like solar panels and wind turbines. But have you heard of biochar? Burning agricultural waste and plowing it back into the ground, where it's an incredible fertilizer and it puts the carbon back in the soil, which is exactly where we need it. Clean cook stove programs would save millions of lives of women and children a year, and it would also reduce the carbon emissions from burning trees and brush. Educating women and girls reduces infant mortality rates. And it also helps reduce the number of children we have because we can actually choose. And it helps those children live longer, healthier lives. And did you know, number 3 on their list is food waste? We throw out over 40% of the food we produce. And if it were its own country, food waste would be number 3 after China and the United States. So there are solutions. But when it comes to us, I want to show you the most important thing we can do. You're going to say, I know what it is. It's light bulbs. Nope. It's eating local food. No. Now, these are very important, and I do them. It is recycling. Also important, not the most important thing. It's a plant-based diet. Also important, not the most important thing. Electric cars, solar panels. No. The most important thing I learned from looking at public opinion data. This is a map by county of the whole US where they asked people, do you think global warming is happening? Anywhere that's orange is more than 50%, and the darker the color, the more people say yes. Do you think global warming will harm people in the United States? We start to see a little bit more blue here. And if you want to zoom in, I have Lee County right here. 52% of people in Lee County think that global warming will harm people in the US, and that compares to the national average of 57, so it's a little bit below national average. Do you agree with the science? We often think this is the biggest problem. Here in Lee County, we've got 49% of people agree with the science. But this is not the darkest blue map. Do you think global warming will harm you personally? Oh, it's really dark. And then there's one more. Do you ever talk about it? And here is Lee County. 30%, and you're one of the lightest counties in Alabama. So even you talk about it more than almost any other county in Alabama, and it's only 30% of people say they even hear anybody else ever talk about it. So what is the most important thing that any single one of us can do? It is talk about it. And that's what I said for my TED Talk. I'm not going to give you my TED Talk. You can go watch it, or you can read it. But the number one thing we can do is talk about it, because, follow my logic, if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we act? What will we talk about? We'll talk about the 2 things we talked about tonight, how climate change matters to us in the places where we live, and how there really, truly are solutions. The most important thing we can do is talk about it. The second most important thing we can do is join an organization that helps amplify your voice. There are organizations for birders. There are organizations for paddlers. There are organizations for mothers. There are organizations for parents, too. There are organizations for people of faith. There are organizations for young people. There are organizations for old people. There's elders for climate change. There are organizations for whoever you are. And some of those tables are out there. In fact, Citizens Climate Lobby is out there with a table. Join an organization that amplifies your voice and advocate for action and vote. 21,000 evangelical students petitioned for 100% clean energy in Indiana. Farmers advocating for climate solutions. Winter athletes, as part of Protect Our Winters, going to Congress and saying, I am a winter athlete and we need snow. Mothers taking their children in and saying, look, this is why we need action. When they're talking to people at their university, at their business, at their organization, at their employment, at their city, at their state, at the national level. Because as a Christian, this is the final thing that I believe, that the only thing that counts is when my faith expresses itself through love. So how can climate solutions be an opportunity to express love? Love for each other, love for our sisters and brothers right here, love for those on the other side of the world who are disproportionately suffering the impacts of climate change today, love for the plants and the animals and the living things that make up this planet that we're part of. My final question to you is this. Ready? Get out your phones. Last question. When it comes to climate change, how could you express love? And really what I meant to say is when it comes to climate action, how can you express love? All right. And I would like to say there's no right answer to this, because we're all different. So one woman, after I talked in more detail about expressing love, she said, well, my grandma and I, we like to knit together. So I'm going to find a pattern to do the warming stripes, where you have like a row for every year, and it's blue if it's colder and it's red if it's warmer. And my grandma and I are going to knit the warming stripes for the place where my grandma has lived all her life for as long as she's been alive. That's love. So for her, she would have written knitting there. Another guy who was actually a postdoc at NASA, he said, I love to cook. So when I cook, I talk to people about how climate change is affecting our ingredients. And through cooking with people, you connect with people. So for him, he would have written cooking. So there's no right answer to this. It is whoever we are. We can educate, we can talk, we can vote, we can garden. We can bring people in, we can respect each other. That is a huge way to love. We can confront, we can use water bottles. I think that might be one. Yes, we can carpool, change our habits. We can be aware. I saw food there, that's good too. Whoever we are is somebody who's different, and that means that we each have something to do. But when it comes to climate change, the favorite title that I would give it is this: climate change and climate action is about loving our global neighbor. That is what this is about. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to take 20 minutes of questions now. And if you have a card that you want collected, go ahead and pass your card to the aisles right now. And everybody else, get out your phones, because you can write whatever you want here. There's no need for dots or dashes. You can write a whole sentence. Please put a question mark at the end of the sentence. If you have to leave, now's the time to leave. So if you do have to leave, go ahead. But we're going to do 20 minutes of questions. And here's the twist. Ready? The twist is that you can upvote other people's questions. We won't have time to answer all of them, but we'll answer the top ones. So even if you don't have a question yourself, go there and upvote the ones that you want us to talk about, okay? All right, come on up, Mike and Martine. Mike, I think you need to sit over there so you can read the questions, right? Okay.
So I just want to, we'll thank Katharine at the end, but that was just extraordinary. So thank you so much. So Martine is going to pick questions that Katharine will answer based on the popularity and the quality of the question, and we'll hear what Katharine has to say.
Okay.
All right, here we go. 29.
30.
30, okay, and that seems to be prevailing.
33.
So I think we're ready with the first one.
Yep.
So how to convince rural Christians that climate change is real?
Yes. So often we think that to care about climate change, we have to be a certain type of person. What type of person? An environmentalist, a tree hugger, a liberal, somebody who many people think I'm not. And if you're asking somebody to change who they are, especially if they're, at this age, most of us are pretty happy with who we are. So rather than saying you are not good enough and you need to be different than who you are, the way to have a constructive, positive conversation is to recognize that just about every single person on the planet, I did say just about every person on the planet already has the values they need to care. They just haven't connected the dots. So let me give you an example from my TED Talk. And in my TED Talk, it goes into this in a lot more detail. I'm not a Rotarian, but the first time I was invited to go to the Rotary Club, I walk in, and they have this giant 4-foot banner with their value system printed on it. Very convenient. I wish everybody would walk around with something like that. So it says, it's called the 4-way test, and it says, is it the truth? I thought, oh yeah, climate change is the truth. And then they said, is it beneficial to all? And I said, no, it's not. And they said, is it fair? I said, no, it's absolutely not fair. That's why I care. And I went through the 4-way test, and I realized that that was what climate change was. So, Rotarians, they have a lunch first, right? So I skipped the lunch, and I rearranged my talk into the 4-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Would it build goodwill? And is it beneficial? And so I went through the 4-way test. And when I started off the talk, this was in West Texas, which is probably very similar to Alabama. When I started off the talk, most of the people's body language was like this. And there was a bit of side eye towards the woman who had invited me. Like, we know what you did, and you're off the invitation committee after this. But as I started going through the 4-way test, you could see the arms unfolding, and you could see the body starting to lean forward, and you could see the head starting to nod. And at the end, everybody was engaged, and I had a lot of questions afterwards. And at the very end, a local businessman came up to me who I had met before, and he had the most bemused look on his face I have ever seen. And he said, I never thought too much about this whole global warming thing, which is the polite Texan way of saying I thought it was a load of crap. But it passed the 4-way test. So in other words, what can I do? This is my value system. It passed the 4-way test. Therefore, I am a Rotarian, so I care. So that's how we can have conversations with people. If you don't know what value they have, then talk to them, get to know them, figure out what makes them tick. What do they care about? In just about every single case, again, whether it's knitting or cooking, whether it's stewarding the land, whether it's caring about your kids or the economy or even national security, in almost every case, you can draw a connection between something they already care about and how climate change affects it, and how there's a positive solution that they would be able to get on board with that does not involve destroying the economy. It does not involve the government telling you what to do. It does not involve the Antichrist taking over the world. For most people, that's an extreme negative. I get emails about this. I'm not making this up. But it's a solution that grows jobs, that puts money in our pocket, that actually leads to healthier soils or better air, that grows the local economy. We can have these positive conversations if we begin with one word, in the words of Aretha Franklin, respect. If we respect each other and we recognize that the other person does have good values and we just haven't connected the dots yet, that's how we can have the good conversations.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, yes. Katharine. So the next one, 35. Given the current political situation in the U.S., how do you avoid despair?
Yeah. Number one is don't read the news in the morning. So I am so delighted because when the questions first started, I was getting slightly worried. This is why I was getting worried, because I collect these questions. I've been collecting these questions all around North America now for over a year. And I don't always ask people, but when I do, I look to see what are the 2 top questions. And what I noticed this past year is that the 2 top questions I get anywhere, at a big public university in California, at a church in South Carolina, at a clean energy group in Canada, the 2 top questions that I've been getting the past 2 years is, how do I have a conversation about climate change with fill in the blank, and what gives you hope? So I decided to write a book this year, and I just handed in my manuscript yesterday. And when I say yesterday, I mean 11:59. And that's what the book was about. It was about those 2 questions. So it was just the first draft. Don't get too excited. It's going to take at least 6 to 8 months before it actually comes out. But I wrote a whole book about those 2 questions because I think they're the most important questions. What gives me hope is not the science. What gives me hope is not the politics. What gives me hope is going out and looking for the good news of what real people are doing to make a difference in the world. What gives me hope is having conversations with people and learning about what's happening. What gives me hope is acting. Action gives us hope. It's the antidote to despair when we act. And what gives us hope is when we see other people acting too. You might think, well, I'm nobody special. I'm not good at talking. I couldn't, even get on social media, let alone make a YouTube video, let alone get up in front of a crowd. Well, let me tell you this story. I will tell you actually 2 stories about the power of talking and how they give hope. Story number 1 is my TED Talk came out last December, so just over a year ago. And in May, I was giving a talk, and a man came up to me afterwards who said, well, I took the train in to listen to you talk because I'd watched your TED Talk, and ever since then, I've been having conversations about climate change in the city where I live. There's about 160,000 people in my city. He said, I've been keeping a list of all the people that we've had climate conversations with. Would you like to see the list? I said, of course. I expected, maybe 80 or 90 names. So he reaches in his bag, he pulls out a sheaf of papers. He says, there's 10,000 names on this list. And he said, because of the conversations that we have had in the 5 months since your TED Talk came out, our city council has just voted to declare a climate emergency. That's the power of a conversation. And now he said they're up to 12,000. Now, let me give you an even more hopeful example. Imagine if you're 15 years old, you're really not very good at speaking, there's not a lot you can do, you're very ordinary, but you can get a piece of cardboard and you can paint some letters on it. So you get a piece of cardboard, you paint some letters on it that say School Strike for Climate, and you go and you sit outside a building 1 day a week. You start doing that 2 years ago, and your name is Greta, and now you are the most known name in the world when it comes to climate change. All she did was take a piece of cardboard and write some letters on it. Never doubt that a single person can make a difference. We can all make a difference, and that action is what gives us hope. Oh, that's an interesting question there.
I'm just judging them. It's 29, 30.
Oh. You better keep voting.
Okay, I like it. I wanna skip one. I'm sorry, but
okay.
Since I'm here, do you think we really have a chance to slow down and reverse climate change?
Oh, that's a good question. So that's something that we both think about a lot because we're climate scientists. It's kind of like we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for a couple of decades. There is some lung damage that is irreversible. Some impacts of climate change are here today. Some impacts are still going to happen in the future no matter what we do because they're baked into the system already. But we do not have emphysema, we do not have lung cancer, and we aren't dead. So when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible. When's the best time to wean ourselves off carbon? As soon as possible. There's no magic number that's going to save us because some places are already experiencing dangerous impacts. But what I do as a scientist is I study the difference between a future where we continue to depend on fossil fuels and a future where we wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And I can tell you there is a night and day difference between those two futures. So it is not too late not to save our planet. Our planet will still be orbiting the sun. It is not too late to save our civilization. And that's really what's at stake.
Thank you.
Now, if you don't mind, I'm just going to turn it back on you guys a little bit. Would you mind answering the question about how you avoid despair? I would love to just hear from both of you briefly on that. Wouldn't you? Yeah, yeah.
The answer is when. So it's similar to you. It's by sharing, a lot is by teaching my students and hearing and just interacting with them and realizing that they really care. And when I see that they're responding and they're understanding the problem and they end up really caring about it, I feel hope. And also by seeing all the movements that are happening right now, every day I see new movements of students, of companies, industries that are moving in the right direction. And that wasn't happening only 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's big changes that are happening right now, and I feel very hopeful with the newer generations. We were talking about, when I started teaching climate change and society about 6-7 years ago, I used to ask them in the beginning of the class, rank from 1 to 5, how concerned climate change is. Number 1, it's not a matter of concern, it's just another issue. 5 is one of the most important, serious issues that humans are facing. When I started asking these questions 6 years ago, most students would rank that in number 1 or 2. And in my class, and most of them, they're here, I asked them, and they ranked it 4 or 5. So the newer generations are thinking that this is one of the most important problems. And that I was so excited. I told them about this, and that fills me with excitement and hope.
Yes. So the common denominator here is what? People. Having conversations, interacting with each other as humans. What about you, Mike?
It depends on the day. There's some days I really have to struggle not to feel despair. But when I think about two things, really. When I think about giving in to despair, it is simply not a choice. I have a grandson. There's no way I want him or any other child to inherit a world from me that's so much less than the one I inherited. So it's just not a choice to give in to despair. And the other thing is, it's kind of what you were talking about, Katharine, it's connecting at the level of values. I mentioned in the introduction our common humanity, our shared, I wrote a column this month in our newsletter. You should read it. It's really great. It's about evaluating our humanity in the 21st century. And I cite a chunk from the great law of the Iroquois, which was written between the 12th and the 16th centuries. I mean, 800 years ago. And if you read it, it reflects values that are universal and timeless. So if we can connect to each other on the level of values, meet people in what they really care about, and if we can create trust and have a different kind of conversation, if we will learn the skills of civic engagement, what it means to be a citizen in a democracy, we can work across difference. I guarantee you that no matter where we are on the political perspective, if we get to a real conversation, we agree on at least 80% of the things that we care about. And that's a powerful place to begin. It's an art. It's that open, sincere caring. It's seeing what Thomas Merton calls the hidden wholeness in others and speaking to that as opposed to demonizing the other. There's such power in that, and I have witnessed it. I know so many of us have witnessed it. that's what really gives me hope. And so the more I think we can act from that standpoint, our common humanity, our shared values, I think that will be the tipping point.
Yeah, love that. That's great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you?
Do we have
do
time
we have
for one or
another
two
question?
quick questions? Okay.
Okay.
We'll do some quick ones. Here we go.
Okay.
Oh, some people are trying to influence the vote.
Oh, it's changing. Please, don't move
Yeah.
it, please.
Well, while you're
Okay,
thinking,
okay,
I'll
yes.
answer one quickly while you're thinking. How do you deal with the distrust in science, or you as a messenger?
Yeah, that's a,
Follow me on Twitter and you'll see. It happens every day, and it is very frustrating. Like, as climate scientists, we study past climate, we study present, we study future, and we have people telling us every day, don't you know it's been warmer before? And I'm like, well, how do you know it's been warmer before? Because we told you. So it is absolutely frustrating. But what I had to do very consciously is I had to decide I give up my right to be respected. Because there are always going to be people who won't respect you. And if you're always fighting to be respected, you're not going to be effective in reaching other people. So if somebody wants to call me an idiot or a fool or somebody who knows nothing, or go back to school and learn more about a class I actually teach, I just let it go. Because if we're going to spend all our time getting people to try to treat us properly, we're not going to spend any of our time actually fixing climate. So it really is a choice, I think. All right. So what question did you have your eye on? Yes.
well, that was actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Well, there's one that people are really pushing to the top. It's number 2 now.
Okay.
They really want you to pick
okay,
it.
we're gonna do that. How do you feel about vegan, vegetarian diets? Do they help? And is it a big difference between being vegan and vegetarian?
Oh! Okay. Well, I'm gonna cheat slightly because I'll combine this with another question down there, which is, what do you wish people would ask you? So I'm gonna put those two together, okay? So, does individual action matter? Of course it does, because the world is made up of people, and we, here in North America, use the resources equivalent to 4 planets worth. If everybody lived like us, we would need 4 planets to produce the resources we consume. So reducing our carbon footprint, reducing our resource footprint, stepping on the carbon scales, going online and Googling carbon footprint calculator, write that down if you want to, carbon footprint calculator, and figuring out where your resources are being consumed, where your carbon emissions come from, is important. And a good carbon footprint calculator will tell us, hey, the biggest part of your carbon footprint is X, Y, and Z. For many of us, it is our diet. If we eat a lot of meat, that could be the biggest part of our carbon footprint. And you might say, well, but what else am I supposed to eat? The answer to that is there are a lot of other things that you can eat. But you don't have to go whole hog, or not whole hog, you don't have to go no hog. That was a Freudian slip. You don't have to go no hog all at once. You can be like, okay, I'm going to do meatless Mondays. So on Mondays, I'm going to figure out how I can eat without eating meat. And they're like, oh, well, that's actually really good. I love what I ate. Let's have that another day. That could be for you the biggest part of your carbon footprint. For other people, it might be if they commute a lot, especially if you lived in suburban Atlanta and you drove, in the traffic. For me, biggest part of my carbon footprint was my flying. And it wasn't my vacation flying. The last vacation we actually went on was my honeymoon. Now, we do take vacations, but we just go to see family, that's all. The biggest part of my carbon footprint was flying around to talk about climate change. And so I thought to myself, that isn't too good. So what I decided to do was I decided to transition 80% of the talks I give to virtual talks. So this is one of the few talks that I give in person. And when Martine invited me, I said, I don't come anywhere just to give one talk. The only way I travel is if I can bundle together 5, 8, 10, 12 events so that the carbon footprint of each event is as if I just kind of drove there in my little car from where I live. So stepping on the carbon calculator and calculating your footprint is really important, but Even if every single one of us in the US who were alarmed about climate change reduced our carbon footprint to nothing, that would only be 14% of US emissions. And that is why the most important thing we can do is use our voices, join organizations that amplify our voices, and advocate for change and vote at the system-wide scale. Because if we aren't all in this together, we are not going to be able to fix it. So when people say, what's the most important thing that I wish people would ask, I wish they'd ask me, well, what can I do? Because my answer to you would be, what you're good at. You're different than anybody else in this room. There's something that you can do, there's something that you're good at, there's something that you love, there's something that you know that is different than anybody else in this room. And that is what you bring to the table. And that is why having so many diverse voices from across the political spectrum, from across the religious spectrum, from across the age spectrum, that is why having so many diverse voices is so important, because when we use our voice as being that unique person that we are, we can make a unique difference together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was just outstanding. Katharine, I know that what's going to happen.
Oh, thank you.